The campus of Hawthorne Boarding School stretched across the suburban hills like a remnant from another century, brick walls the color of rust, ivy curling up to the second-story windows, and long corridors that hummed faintly when the wind slipped through the cracks. It was the kind of place where time felt slightly wrong, as if each day replayed the last with minor distortions. The smell of floor polish and old wood lingered everywhere, even in the dorm rooms where students tried to carve out pieces of their own world. Ethan arrived at the school in late autumn of 8th grade. He was the quiet, kind, polite, slightly anxious, trying to blend in. His parents said the school would build character. What it built instead was a silence in him, something that grew heavier with each week. The dormitory he was assigned to, room 12B, was small and symmetrical. 2 beds, 2 desks, 1 narrow window looking out toward a gray courtyard where the flagpole clinked against its chain in the wind. His roommate was a boy named Weston Hale. Weston didn't say much on the first day.
Is this some kind of joke?
He had pale hair that always seemed damp and a calm, watchful manner, the kind that made Ethan unsure if he was being studied or ignored. When Weston spoke, it was with odd precision, as if every word were weighed before being released. The other students thought he was just strange. Ethan wasn't sure what to think. There was nothing visibly wrong with him, no outbursts, no cruelty, just an absence of warmth that felt like standing near an unplugged lamp. Everything looked normal, but there was no light. The first weeks passed quietly. They attended classes, ate in the dining hall, pretended to laugh at the same things as everyone else. Nights were different, though. Nights in the dorm had a peculiar stillness. After lights out, the building seemed to settle, exhaling through its wooden bones. Ethan often lay awake, listening to the old pipes tick and whisper. Then came the night Weston approached him with something folded in his hand, a piece of notebook paper, creased so many times it looked soft. "I made this for you," Weston said. Ethan thought it might be a schedule, or maybe dorm rules, but when he unfolded it, he found a list. It read, "No frogs, no mirrors larger than a hand, no photographs of eyes, no salt." Ethan blinked. "What is this?" he asked. Weston looked perfectly serious. "Things that can't come in the room." "You mean like a joke?" Weston didn't answer. He simply turned, climbed into bed, and shut off his lamp. At first, Ethan wanted to laugh. It was too strange not to be funny. But as he stared at the list, written in careful, uneven handwriting, he felt an odd chill settle around him. No salt. That one made the least sense. Food wasn't even allowed in the dorms. Still, Weston had spoken with the same tone a doctor might use when prescribing medication not for humor, but necessity. The next day, Ethan folded the list and put it in his desk drawer. He tried to forget about it. But small things began to build things too quiet to explain. Weston whispered at night, full conversations in the dark, though no one else was there. Sometimes the air in the room would shift suddenly cold, and Ethan would wake to find Weston sitting upright, staring at the window like he was watching something invisible breathe against the glass. Once, Ethan caught a glimpse of Weston's notebook half hidden under the mattress when the boy changed sheets. It was filled with names, each written neatly in columns. Many were scratched out. Ethan's name sat near the bottom, untouched. He didn't ask about it. He didn't even want to. That night, the wind outside grew louder than usual, scraping the branches against the window pane. Ethan lay in bed trying not to listen, but somewhere between sleep and waking, he heard Weston murmur a phrase, soft, rhythmic in a language that didn't sound like any he knew. And for the first time since coming to Hawthorne, Ethan realized something unmistakable. He wasn't afraid of the dark itself, but of what might already be standing inside it. Nights at Hawthorne grew longer once winter took hold. The snow outside thickened like muffled static, and the radiators wheezed with a kind of mechanical sigh. Ethan had started to notice that his sleep came lighter every week, as though his body no longer trusted the dark. He tried to ignore the small things first. Weston's muttering, the faint movement of his lips when he thought Ethan was asleep. Sometimes, Ethan would catch fragments. Not tonight, not yet. Stay away. Other times, the whispers were too quiet to make out, just a thread of sound weaving through the darkness. Then came the knocking. It began one night just after midnight. A soft, deliberate knock, not at the door, but somewhere inside the room. Ethan sat up, heart thudding. Weston was awake too, staring toward his desk. The sound came again. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't the pipes. It was too intentional. "Did you hear that?" Ethan asked. Weston didn't answer. He got up slowly, his bare feet silent on the wooden floor, and crouched beside the small closet in the corner. He pressed his ear against the wood. Then he whispered something not to Ethan, but to the door itself. The knocks stopped. Ethan wanted to ask, but the look on Weston's face, calm, almost satisfied, froze the words in his throat. Weston returned to bed, pulled the blanket up to his chin, and whispered, "It's gone." "What's gone?" Ethan managed. Weston's eyes stayed open in the dark. "You shouldn't have salt here. It can't cross the line if there's salt." The room fell silent again, except for Ethan's heartbeat thudding in his ears. He didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By morning, the world outside looked clean and bright. The snow on the quad shimmered, and students ran laughing between buildings, tossing slush at each other. It all felt too normal, too disconnected from what had happened in that room. But that night, the unease returned. Ethan woke to the sound of muttering again, closer this time, right above him. He opened his eyes to find Weston standing over his bed. The other boy's face was half lit by the moon through the window. His lips moved soundlessly at first, then the words came, slow and deliberate. "You talk in your sleep," Weston whispered. Ethan sat up fast, pulse hammering. "What are you doing?" Weston's smile didn't change. "You were saying my name." He stayed standing there, still smiling. His hands were lifted slightly, as if about to reach out, but he didn't. He just stared. "Go back to bed," Ethan said, trying to sound calm. Weston tilted his head, still grinning faintly, then stepped backward into the dark and lay down without another word. Ethan didn't sleep after that. Every sound, the wind against the glass, the creak of the floorboards made him flinch. By dawn, his nerves were shredded. When he tried to bring it up the next morning, Weston looked genuinely confused, as if he didn't remember a thing. "I was asleep all night," he said, rubbing his eyes. His tone was mild, almost pitying. Ethan wanted to believe him. He really did. But something in Weston's eyes, an absence of surprise, an undercurrent of knowledge, made him feel small, like a child insisting on monsters under the bed, while the monster listened quietly from behind him. Days passed. Ethan started spending more time anywhere but the dorm. The library, the gym, even empty classrooms. But sooner or later, he always had to come back. The room seemed colder each night, as if something invisible drained the warmth out of the air the moment the lights went off. Then came the snake. He found it coiled on his blanket when he returned from study hall one evening, small, dark green, tongue flicking the air. Ethan froze, the door half open behind him. Weston was sitting at his desk, unmoving, his eyes following the snake's slow movement. Ethan's voice cracked. What the hell is that? Weston didn't answer immediately. He stood, reached across the desk, and lifted a small glass jar. It's just a garden snake, he said softly. They like it here. Ethan backed toward the door. How did it get in my bed? They find their way, Weston said. They always do. He opened the jar and, impossibly, the snake slithered right in like it had been waiting for him. The glass clinked shut. Ethan's stomach turned. What's wrong with you, man? Weston looked at him, expression blank. What do you mean? They're everywhere. That night, Ethan lay awake listening to the faint scraping of glass as Weston's jar shifted on the desk. It made a rhythmic sound, like something trying to move inside but not quite strong enough to escape. Every few minutes, Weston would whisper to it. By the fourth night, Ethan started dreaming of the snake. Except in the dream, it wasn't a snake. It was a dark, shapeless cloud twisting above his bed, pulsing with a heartbeat that wasn't his. It moved like smoke but felt solid, as though the air itself had turned heavy. He couldn't move. He couldn't scream. The thing drifted down, and from within it, a hand, black, elongated, reached toward his face. It scratched the wooden frame of the bed before recoiling violently, as if burned. Then it tore across the room, knocking over the jar, scattering papers, smashing through the window in a burst of cold air. Glass rained down like frozen rain. Ethan woke with his neck twisted toward the shattered window. The room looked exactly like it had in the dream shards glittering on the floor, the winter air slicing in. His breath came in short gasps. He turned his head and saw scratches on the bed frame, deep and fresh. He couldn't move for a full minute. Then, when he finally could, he rushed to Weston's bed. Weston was asleep, or pretending to be, snoring softly. Ethan shook him, desperate for reaction, for proof of something human. But Weston didn't wake. His breathing was steady, detached, and for the first time, Ethan felt something worse than fear. A sense of being completely alone with something that was not supposed to exist. The next morning, the broken window was impossible to ignore. Shards still littered the floor, and the air that came through the crack felt sharper than before, as if the outside world itself wanted in. Ethan barely slept. His thoughts looped between fragments of the dream and the reality that matched it too perfectly. When Weston finally stirred, stretching with a faint yawn, Ethan's chest tightened with anger and confusion. "You're telling me you didn't hear that?" he demanded. Weston rubbed his eyes. "Hear what?" "The glass, the wind, the thing that broke in." Weston's brow furrowed as though genuinely perplexed. "You must have had a nightmare." Ethan pointed at the shattered window. That nightmare broke reality. Weston just looked at it, his expression unreadable. "Then maybe you shouldn't dream so loud." The calmness of that remark made Ethan's skin crawl. He almost expected Weston to smile, but he didn't. He simply began gathering his books for class, stepping barefoot across the cold floor as if the shards didn't bother him. Ethan watched, half expecting him to bleed, but Weston's feet left no marks. The administration was called later that morning. A resident assistant asked questions, wrote notes, and promised repairs. Weston said nothing. He sat on his bed, eyes on the floor, as though this had nothing to do with him. That silence began to feel heavier than any sound. The following days blurred. Classes, lunch, laughter in the hallways all seemed detached from the frozen tension in room 12B. Ethan avoided Weston as best he could, but even when Weston wasn't there, the room felt inhabited. It smelled faintly metallic, like the air before lightning. At night, he'd lie awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling, half expecting the sound of whispers to return. They always did. He started noticing things, little patterns. The list Weston had given him, for example. No frogs, no mirrors larger than a hand, no photographs of eyes, no salt. At first, they were nonsense, but now maybe not. The scratches on his bed frame formed odd shapes, nearly symmetrical curves, lines like sigils. He traced them with his finger one morning and noticed faint white dust along the grooves. When he licked his fingertip without thinking, the taste hit him instantly. Salt. Something in the air shifted. A sudden pressure, like being watched. He snapped his hand away, heart pounding. Ethan decided to talk to Miss Harland, the dorm supervisor, one of the few adults who seemed to listen to students. He waited until evening study hall, then approached her office, still smelling faintly of coffee and chalk. She looked up from her papers. "Ethan? Something wrong?" He hesitated. "It's about my roommate, Weston Hale." Her pen froze mid-stroke. "What about him?" "He's different," Ethan said carefully. "He talks to himself. He keeps lists. And last night our window broke," she finished for him. "Yes, I was told." There was something guarded in her tone. Ethan frowned. "You sound like you already know." Miss Harland sighed and removed her glasses. "Weston has been here longer than most boys his age. His parents traveled often, left him in the school's care. He's quiet but harmless." "Harmless," Ethan whispered. "He stands over me at night. He keeps snakes in jars." She smiled faintly, though her eyes betrayed discomfort. "He's eccentric, yes. But Ethan, the human mind plays tricks when it's under stress. You're young, far from home. You might be projecting." "I saw something," he interrupted. "Something that wasn't a dream." Her expression shifted, then not disbelief, but something closer to fear, quickly buried. "You should get some rest," she said softly. "Weston won't be your roommate much longer." That night, Ethan returned to the dorm to find Weston's bed empty. Relief washed through him until he noticed the notebook lying open on the desk. He shouldn't have looked. He knew that. But curiosity felt less dangerous than ignorance. He stepped closer. The pages were filled again. The list of names had grown, and more were now crossed out. His eyes flicked to the last page, where his own name remained untouched, but beside it, a date had been added. December 12. It was tomorrow. A sound behind him made him freeze. Weston stood in the doorway, snow in his hair, watching silently. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "You shouldn't read things that aren't yours." Ethan turned, heart pounding. "What is this? A hit list? Some game?" Weston tilted his head. "Not mine. I just keep track." "Of what?" Weston looked down at the floor. "Who they take." He said it like he was confessing something sacred. Ethan's mouth went dry. "Who takes them?" he whispered. "The ones that come through the glass," Weston said. "The salt keeps them out. That's why I told you." His voice broke slightly, like a child trying to explain a rule no one believed. "They can't stand salt. It burns them. You let it in when you touched it." Ethan felt his pulse echo in his ears. "You're insane," he said, backing away. Weston's eyes flicked to the window now repaired, gleaming faintly in the moonlight. "No, you're just too late." Ethan turned and ran. He didn't remember much after that, just fragments. Footsteps echoing down empty corridors. The sound of his own breathing. the faint whispering that followed him even beyond the dorm. When he finally stopped outside under the frozen trees, the world seemed eerily silent. For the first time since coming to Hawthorne, he felt the air press against him like something alive. Somewhere behind him, the bell tower struck midnight, and in the distance, he thought he heard glass shatter again. Ethan didn't go back to the dorm that night. He stayed in the library until dawn, hunched over an armchair that smelled of dust and paper, pretending to read. The campus slept behind him silent, still, buried in fog. He told himself he would switch rooms in the morning, talk to the headmaster, demand a transfer, anything to escape Weston. But the morning came, pale and brittle, and nothing changed. Weston didn't come to breakfast. His seat was empty, his plate untouched. No one else seemed to notice. The teachers called attendance as usual. The students joked, oblivious. Ethan sat among them, cold creeping beneath his skin. By the second class period, he started to feel a strange pull, a compulsion to check the room, to make sure Weston was still there, or gone. Either way, he needed to know. At lunch, he couldn't take it anymore. He slipped out of the dining hall and made his way toward the dormitory. The hall's empty except for the sound of his footsteps echoing against the tile. When he reached room 12B, the door was slightly ajar. Inside, the air was colder than outside. The repaired window glimmered faintly with frost. Weston's bed was made with unnatural precision blanket tucked tight, pillow perfectly centered. But the desk was covered in salt. Tiny white grains formed a ring around the jar that had once held the snake. The jar was empty now, but streaked with black residue, like soot. And in the center of the salt ring, Weston's notebook lay open. Ethan approached slowly. The pages had changed again. The names were gone. Every line scratched through violently, as though erased from existence. In their place, across 2 pages, someone had scrawled a single phrase in jagged handwriting. It's inside the walls now. Ethan's breath fogged in front of him. He turned, instinctively, toward the closet, the one Weston had pressed his ear against weeks before. Something inside was moving, softly at first, then with a low, scraping sound like nails on wood. He stumbled backward, knocking over the chair. "Weston," he whispered. No answer. Only the sound scraping, shifting, breathing. He took another step toward the door, ready to run. Then the closet opened. The door swung forward an inch, then another. Darkness poured out, thick and heavy. The air turned colder still. Ethan froze, staring at the widening gap, and inside, something stirred. Not a shape, not even a shadow. It was like the absence of light had learned to move. He heard it before he saw it, a wet, slow inhalation, like the room itself was taking a breath. Then came a faint rustling, and within that blackness, faint reflections. Eyes. Too many eyes. Ethan lunged for the door. His hand brushed the metal handle, burning cold, and then a force yanked him backward, unseen fingers wrapping around his ankle. He screamed and kicked, the sound raw in his throat. His foot connected with something solid and soft at the same time. The grip loosened. He crawled across the floor, gasping, and stumbled to his feet. When he turned, the darkness was spilling from the closet, rolling across the floor like smoke underwater. It reached the salt ring around the jar and stopped writhing, recoiling. The white grains glimmered faintly, almost alive. Weston's voice came from behind him. "You shouldn't have touched it." Ethan spun around. Weston was standing by the bed, pale, eyes wide, trembling like a wire. His pupils were blown wide, black swallowing the blue. "Weston! What is that?" Ethan choked out. "They live in the cracks," Weston whispered. "They come for the ones who hear them. You heard them, didn't you?" Ethan shook his head. "You're insane." "They don't like salt," Weston went on, as if he hadn't heard. "Salt keeps the world straight. It keeps them out." "Then help me," Ethan shouted. "How do we stop it?" Weston looked down at his hands. "We can't. Only one of us gets to stay." For a moment, silence filled the room. The only sound was the wind outside, brushing against the broken edges of the glass. Then Weston stepped into the darkness. Ethan screamed a sound torn out of pure instinct, but Weston didn't hesitate. The black mass swallowed him instantly, rising up like liquid smoke. Wrapping around his body, his scream came late, a strangled cry that cut off as suddenly as it began. The salt ring flared white. The smell of ozone filled the room. The darkness shuddered, convulsing, and then, with a sound like 1,000 whispers inhaling at once, it burst upward and vanished through the ceiling. Ethan was thrown backward by the force, slamming against the wall. For a long time, he didn't move. His breath came ragged, his vision blurred. When the silence finally returned, it was worse than any sound. He woke to daylight streaming through the window. The air was still, perfectly ordinary. Weston's bed was empty. The salt on the floor had turned to dust. For a moment, Ethan thought he'd dreamed it. But the jar still sat on the desk, cracked down the side. The notebook lay open again, a new page filled in Weston's neat handwriting. It followed the wrong one. The rest of the page was blank. Ethan packed his things and went straight to the headmaster's office, demanding a room change. By evening, he was moved to another dorm 2 floors down, a different wing. The staff said Weston's parents had arrived unexpectedly that morning and taken him home. Ethan didn't question it. He didn't care. But that night, as he lay in the new room, a faint sound came from the radiator, a whisper, soft and distant. Tap, tap, tap. He pressed his hands over his ears and waited for dawn. By morning, the official story had already taken shape. The broken glass, the noise, the incident, all rewritten into a version safe enough for the adults to understand. The headmaster called Ethan into his office. A high-ceilinged room lined with old books. The faint smell of pipe smoke trapped in the wood. He listened as the man spoke in a voice designed for comfort, not truth. "Weston's parents came to collect him early this morning," the headmaster said. "There was a family matter. I'm told he won't be returning this semester." Ethan nodded, but inside he felt nothing. Just the hum of disbelief, hollow and distant. "What about the window? The mess in the room?" The headmaster smiled faintly. "You boys have wild imaginations. The maintenance staff cleaned everything. Nothing to worry about." Nothing to worry about. It was the phrase that adults use to cover everything they didn't want to believe. When Ethan left the office, the corridor outside was filled with laughter. The other students were returning from class, backpacks swinging, their breath fogging in the cold. To them, the world was still safe, structured, unbroken. Ethan envied them for that. He moved to a new dorm that afternoon, room 6D. His new roommate was a boy named Harris, loud, friendly, the kind of person who made noise just by existing. Harris talked constantly, and Ethan found that comforting at first. He wanted sound around him. Sound meant life. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of normalcy. Class, lunch, study hall, sleep. Almost like before. Almost. A week later, the first incident happened. Ethan woke up around 3 a.m. to a faint sound. Not a knock this time, but a scraping, like nails dragged slowly across wood. He turned over, half expecting to see Weston's silhouette, but the bed across from him held only Harris, snoring softly. The sound came again, sharper now. Ethan sat up. It was coming from the radiator. He got out of bed, heart beating faster, and crouched beside it. The metal grill was cold to the touch, but beneath it, the noise continued scratching, shifting, like something alive trapped inside. He leaned closer. "Hello?" he whispered, immediately hating himself for saying it. The scratching stopped. Then, faintly, from deep inside the vent, came a voice, a whisper, almost human. He couldn't make out the words. At first it sounded like a breath pressed through teeth. Then he caught fragments. "Not him. Wrong one. Salt gone." Ethan stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. Harris groaned, half awake. "What's your problem, man?" Ethan didn't answer. He backed away from the vent, staring. The whispering was gone. By morning, he convinced himself it had been a dream. A trick of the mind, sleep deprivation. Anything but what it felt like. Still, he noticed that the air in room 6D never warmed again. Even with the heat running, the corners stayed cold. A few days later, Miss Harland stopped him in the hallway. Her usual composure seemed cracked. Her eyes were red-rimmed, as though she hadn't slept. "Ethan," she said quietly, "may I speak with you for a moment?" They stepped into an empty classroom. She shut the door. "Did Weston contact you?" Ethan blinked. "What?" "No." "Why?" Her voice lowered. "His parents called the school yesterday. He never came home. They haven't seen him since the day he left campus." For a moment, the air between them went still. Ethan felt the world tilt slightly, as if gravity had shifted. "He's missing?" She nodded. "They found his belongings in a motel room 2 towns over. His clothes, his wallet, even his notebook. But no trace of him." Ethan tried to speak, but his throat felt tight. The notebook. He pictured the last line. It followed the wrong one. "Maybe he ran away," Ethan said finally, voice unsteady. "Maybe," Miss Harland replied. But her eyes told a different story. "If you remember anything unusual, you'll tell me?" He nodded. She hesitated, then added, "You should try to rest, Ethan. Sometimes things attach themselves to memory. Best not to feed them." The phrase made no sense, and yet it did. Weeks passed. The semester ended. Ethan went home for winter break, but his house didn't feel safe either. The corners of his room felt darker than before. When he closed his eyes, he sometimes saw shapes behind them, faint outlines shifting in the dark, like the memory of something that refused to fade. He stopped sleeping with the lights off. One night, while unpacking his things, he found the list Weston had given him that first week folded, creased, still faintly smelling of old paper. No frogs. No mirrors larger than a hand. No photographs of eyes. No salt. His stomach tightened. The edges of the paper were smudged with something that looked like ash. He started to tear it in half, but something in him froze. The handwriting, once sharp, now looked slightly different. New letters had been added, small and faint, beneath the last line. No sound. The lamp on his desk flickered. For a heartbeat, he thought he heard tapping again, faint, inside the walls. He turned off the light and sat in the dark, waiting, listening. Nothing. But long after he lay in bed, the silence itself began to sound alive. A slow, rhythmic pulse behind the walls, breathing in sync with his own, And though he tried not to believe it, a thought whispered through his mind, steady and cold. It didn't follow the wrong one after all. VI, the ending symbol and haunting message. Years later, Ethan would try to convince himself that what happened at Hawthorne had been nothing but stress and sleeplessness, the fragile mind of a teenager cracking under isolation. He would repeat it like a prayer, but each time he did, something deep inside him whispered the truth he didn't want to face. He still couldn't sleep in silence. By then, he was 24, working nights as a janitor at a community college on the outskirts of Boston. It wasn't the kind of future he'd imagined, but he preferred the quiet, the anonymity. The empty halls at midnight reminded him of Hawthorne, though he'd never admit that out loud. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the echo of his own footsteps, they calmed him. Or maybe he'd just learned to mistake fear for familiarity. It was winter again when the memory came back. Snow against glass, the metallic smell in the air, the faint taste of salt on his lips. He was mopping near the science wing when he noticed the temperature drop subtle, like the air itself inhaled. The fluorescent lights flickered once, twice. Then, from somewhere behind him, came a sound he hadn't heard in nearly a decade. Tap, tap, tap. Ethan froze. His breath misted in the air. It came again, softer this time, almost polite. He turned slowly toward the sound. At the end of the corridor stood a door, one of the older classrooms that hadn't been used in years. The light above it had gone out. The window in the door reflected nothing. He told himself to leave, to walk away. Instead, he found himself moving closer. When he reached the door, the handle was cold, not the metallic chill of winter, but something deeper, wrong, like the cold of a grave. He pressed his ear to the wood. Silence, then whispering. Not words at first, just breath. Then a phrase, faint, childlike. It wasn't the wrong one. Ethan stumbled backward. The mop clattered to the floor. The whispering grew louder. More voices, now dozens, maybe hundreds, all murmuring at once, overlapping like wind through leaves. Beneath it, he heard something scrape against the glass panel in the door, leaving thin white lines that looked like salt. He turned and ran. The corridor stretched longer than it should have, the lights above flickering in sequence as he passed beneath them, flash, dark, flash, dark, until the world became a stuttering film reel of shadow and light. His breath tore through the silence. Somewhere behind him, the whisper followed, steady and soft. Ethan. He burst through the exit door into the snow. The air outside burned his lungs. For a long time, he stood there, doubled over, trying to catch his breath. When he looked back, the hallway beyond the glass door was empty. Just the reflection of his own face, pale and trembling. The janitor's closet, his locker, his coat, he left them all behind that night. A few weeks later, Ethan's supervisor found a resignation letter taped to the office door. It was written neatly, in the same careful handwriting the boy had always used. Nothing unusual, except for the last line. If the walls begin to whisper, cover the vents with salt. No one ever heard from him again. The security footage from that night showed only one strange detail. At 3:11 a.m., a single light flickered on in the science wing. Through the grainy black and white frame, a figure could be seen walking slowly down the hall, carrying a mop. The camera glitched for 6 seconds. When the picture returned, the figure was gone, but something else shimmered faintly on the floor. A thin, uneven line of salt stretching the length of the corridor. They say Hawthorne Boarding School shut down 2 years after Ethan left. The official reason was funding. But local stories claim that strange things started happening again in the dorms, whispers in the vents, cold spots that lingered even in summer, and windows that cracked from the inside. One janitor, years later, swore he found a note taped inside an old closet on the second floor. The paper was brittle, the ink faded. It said only, "No frogs, no mirrors larger than a hand, no photographs of eyes, no salt, no sound." And beneath it, written in fresh pencil, a single new line. "It's listening again." The world moved on. The buildings crumbled. The list changed hands. But sometimes on quiet nights, when the snow presses against old windows and the radiators exhale in broken rhythms, there are still those who hear it. The faint tap, 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 the whisper that breathes through the walls, soft as memory. And somewhere between sleep and waking, in that fragile space where the air turns cold and the mind begins to drift, one can almost hear a voice, low, familiar, and terribly calm. "Don't bring salt into the room.